Soldiers, an overview of African Americans serving in the Continental Army with my buddy John Rees. John has been writing for 35 years on the experiences and material culture of common soldiers and women in the armies of the American Revolution. Subjects include women with the Army, military foods, soldiers' belongings and burden, campaign shelters, and battle and campaign studies. Many of his works are available online. And John's first book was They Were Good Soldiers, African Americans Serving in the Continental Army, 1775 to 1783. And he'll have some titles for sale after the talk. His second book, co-authored with Don Troiani, entitled Black Soldiers Serving in North America's Founding Wars, 1754 to 1765, will be published by Stackpole in January 2025. And John's been a great friend to this site, to myself personally, with his sharing his research, some of which he'll present today. And so I'm very proud to announce John Rees, or introduce him. John?
Thanks, Grant, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. This is a real honor. I really appreciate it. I have two books, but the odd thing is I never intended to write a book. I was asked to write both books, so here I am. As Grant said, most of my stuff is online for free, and I have cards over there. The links are there too. And I too will put on my eyes. In a relatively short time, I hope to give some idea of African Americans' experience as Continental Army soldiers. Along the way, I'll share the stories of several individuals, take a look at how soldiers of color were treated, and tie it all together with some insights into their numbers. I'll close with a portion of the only known, still existing letter written by a revolutionary black soldier to his wife. And before I go into the main portion of my talk, I want to mention two of the three largely all-black regiments that served in the War of the Revolution. I think it's important to mention the black regiments because the Army, as you will see, the Army was integrated. I mean, in my new book, I discovered the New England regiments and some of the Southern regiments were in the French and Indian War were integrated. So you see a timeline. The earliest regiment was the Loyalist Ethiopian Regiment, formed in 1775 with freed slaves, mostly from Virginia, and formed by Royal Governor John Murray, Earl of Dunmore. That unit was disbanded only after 1 year. 6 months later, in March 1777, British Commander-in-Chief Sir William Howe directed that all Negroes, mulattoes, and other improper persons who have been admitted into the Loyalist Corps be immediately discharged. In essence, this meant that armed blacks were not allowed to serve in Crown-established Loyalist regiments. In March 1779, the French military formed the Chasseurs Volontaires de Saint-Domingue in what later became known as Haiti. The regiment consisted of free men of color. Blacks and mulattoes were separated into their own companies, reflecting the colorism rife in Saint-Domingue society. The only large-scale action was the siege of British-held Savannah in autumn 1779. Most of the unit was disbanded in late 1779 by elements that served into 1784. Now back to the Continental Army. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When those words were made public in 1776, there we go. Africans had been enslaved in British North America for almost 160 years, and African Americans had been fighting 14 months for the cause of American independence in the Continental Army, Navy, and States Militia. Not for another 89 years would slavery in the United States be legally ended. At the onset of the War for Independence, approximately 480,000 African Americans lived in the colonies, of whom roughly 24,000 were free, meaning some 456,000, 95%, were enslaved. Total American population at the time was approximately 2.5 million. Using these numbers, free blacks comprised 0.96% of the overall population, and slaves formed 18.24%. By comparison, roughly 5,000 to 7,000 African American soldiers and sailors, free and slave, served the revolutionary cause. Black soldiers' motivations for joining the Continental Army and their treatment while serving are important to any discussion of their military experience. The reasons somewhat mirror those of their fellow white and Indian soldiers. Some fought for national independence and hoped for opportunities in the new republic. Some joined for the adventure of military service. sometimes connected to the prospect of serving alongside family or friends. Others were at least partly enticed by the lure of an enlistment bounty or regular pay. And after the ideals espoused in the Declaration of Independence, some men fought for their own freedom or for that of their loved ones. Some joined as paid substitutes in the place of those who could afford the fee, and forced service was another factor. Oh, sorry. If they were on the militia rolls, both white and black men periodically faced the chance of being drafted for a short-term stint in a Continental regiment. Whites were occasionally compelled to enlist, but enslaved African Americans were more often coerced or forced by their masters to serve. Many, especially in New England, were promised freedom in return for military service, and most of those promises were honored, but some veterans were kept in bondage after their discharge. Of course, the major dividing line between white and black common soldiers was the American system that enslaved 95% of the country's African Americans and relegated blacks to underclass status. In light of their treatment in civilian society, one remarkable result of researching black Continental soldiers is finding that they largely received the same considerations as their white comrades. At the most basic level, soldiers of color, both African and Native Americans, received the same pay, provisions, clothing, and equipment as white soldiers. Both whites and soldiers of color suffered together in times of scarcity and jointly enjoyed the rare times of bounty. The most glaring case of unequal treatment was that black soldiers were, with very few exceptions, barred from serving in any rank other than drummer, fifer, or private soldier. There were other inequities. Early in the war, Africans were occasionally singled out for labor details, but that ended by 1778. There were also indications that black enlisted men served as officers, waiters, or servants more often than white soldiers, but that remains unsubstantiated. And finally, while there were likely difficulties due to officers or fellow soldiers' personal or race animus, to date, no such instances have come to light. So let's turn now to an overview of early service. Black Americans were in the fight from the first. Massachusetts militiamen of color, free and enslaved, fought alongside their white comrades from Lexington to Concord and back to Boston on April 19, 1775. To date, we have the names of 35 black men present that day, at least 18 seen in combat. One, Prince Estabrook, was wounded with Captain John Parker's company on Lexington Green. It's likely that as many as 40 to 50 African Americans were with the militia on the war's first day. 2 months later, at least 88 black and 15 Indian soldiers are known to have served at the Bunker Hill battle. One historian estimates the total may have been as high as 150, roughly 5% of the American troops involved. There are several mentions of black participation in those early actions, but this is my favorite, speaking to the courage and resilience of our African American soldiers, and the effect one man's determination had on another. John Greenwood, a white soldier, noted of that day, "Everywhere the greatest terror and confusion seemed to prevail. As I ran along the road leading to Bunker Hill, it was filled with chairs and wagons, bearing the wounded and the dead. Never having beheld such a sight before, I felt very much frightened. I could positively feel my hair stand on end. Just as I came near the place, a Negro man, wounded in the back of his neck, passed me, and his collar being open and he not having anything on except his shirt and trousers. I saw the wound quite plainly, and the blood running down his back. I asked him if it hurt much. He said no, that he was only going to get a plaster put on it, and meant to return. You cannot conceive what encouragement this immediately gave me. I began to feel brave and like a soldier from that moment, and fear never troubled me afterward during the whole war." Despite their proven ability, some African Americans were early on deemed unfit for Continental service. A May 1775 Massachusetts provincial resolution stated that no slaves be admitted into this army upon any consideration whatsoever. That resolution was actually never voted on. By contrast, an October 1775 Council of Officers agreed unanimously to reject all slaves, and by a great majority to reject Negroes altogether, while November 12 Army orders directed neither Negroes, boys unable to bear arms, nor old men unfit to endure the fatigues of the campaign are to be enlisted. Signaling a change of policy at the end of December, George Washington told of numbers of free Negroes who were desirous of enlisting, giving leave to the recruiting officers to entertain them. And as a side note, black soldiers were never evicted from the Army and continued to serve during this 8-month paper exercise of deciding if they should be soldiers or not. Given the desperate need to fill Continental regiments, General Washington's 21 February 1776 recruiting instructions stated that officers were expressly forbid enlisting any boys, old men, or slaves, with no mention of barring free blacks. And eventually, individual states began allowing enslaved soldiers as well, and by 1778 they formed a sizable minority in the Army. Thus, the American Army remained a racially integrated organization from the war's beginning to end. And black musket-bearing soldiers, Continentals and militia, fought in every major battle of the war, and in most, if not all, of the lesser actions. A number of observers noted the fact of African Americans in the ranks, some unfavorably, with the claim they were unsuited to be soldiers, but positive remarks were in the majority. In response to John Adams' October 1775 question about black soldiers in the Massachusetts regiments, Adams called them unsuitable for service. General William Heath replied, "There are in the Massachusetts regiments some few lads and old men, in several regiments some Negroes. Such is also the case with the regiments from the other colonies. Rhode Island has a number of Negroes and Indians. Connecticut has fewer Negroes, but a number of Indians. The New Hampshire regiments have less of both. The men from Connecticut, I think, in general, are rather stouter than those of either of the other colonies. But the troops of our colony are robust, agile, and as fine fellows in general as I would ever wish to see in the field." General John Thomas was more specific and emphatic. "In the regiments at Roxbury, the privates are equal to any that I served with last war. Very few old men, and in the ranks very few boys. We have some Negroes, but I look on them in general equally serviceable with other men, for fatigue and inaction. Many of them have proved themselves brave. Europeans were also complimentary. In December 1777, a German officer wrote of the American Revolutionary Forces, 'The Negro can take the field in his master's place. Hence you never see a regiment in which there are not a lot of Negroes, and there are well-built, strong, husky fellows among them.' And Baron Ludwig von Closen, aide-de-camp to French General Rochambeau, wrote in July 1781, 'I had a chance to see the American Army man for man. It is really painful to see these brave men almost naked with only some trousers and little linen jackets, most of them without stockings, but, would you believe it, very cheerful and healthy in appearance. It is incredible that soldiers composed of men of every age, even children of 15, of whites and blacks, unpaid and rather poorly fed, can march so fast and withstand fire so steadfastly.' As for numbers, Closen claimed, 'A quarter of Washington's armies were Negroes, Murray, confident, and sturdy.' Now, regarding Closen's estimate of numbers, my research indicates that his estimate is a little bit off. And that while the proportion of black Continentals likely increased in the later war years, in 1781 there were more likely about 8 to 10% of the army. Now let us look into numbers a bit more. In August 1778, a document entitled "A Return of the Negroes in the Army" tallied the number of black soldiers in 15 brigades of General George Washington's main army. Long thought to enumerate all the black men in those brigades, in mid-late 18th century British North America, in official parlance, the term Negro alluded to enslaved people. Thus, that list shows there were 755 slave soldiers in Washington's army that month. In a force totaling almost 21,000 rank and file, corporals, music, and private soldiers, they comprised 3.6% of the whole. By themselves, enslaved soldiers could form 200 strength regiments, each equal to or larger in size than most other serving Continental regiments. We have no idea how many free blacks were then serving, but they were possibly at least on par with their enslaved comrades. If that is true, then 7.2% of the force in question were free and enslaved black men. Now, there were two regiments specifically that were not included on that return. The New Jersey and Rhode Island regiments in 1778. The New Jersey regiments had approximately 10 blacks serving in 4 regiments. The Rhode Island regiments, which were 2 of them, had just reconstituted one of its regiments, the first, filling it with African American and Indian private soldiers, mostly former slaves, but also 55 veterans. In August 1778, that unit contained 188 black privates. Here we have a modern image of a single company of Henley's additional regiment in 1779. It's from the, as you see, it's the Museum of the American Revolution commissioned this. It's a good representation of how many Continental companies would have appeared, with some having a few more black soldiers, and others perhaps none at all. As seen in our discussion of the 1778 Army return, the proportion of African Americans was relatively small, but that's not as important as their mere presence in mixed regiments. One reason is the equation of military service with citizenship, a concept that continued into the mid-19th century. More importantly, foreign observers and others likely considered African Americans serving alongside white soldiers as a radical revolutionary statement. almost on a par with taking up arms against the King's Army and the Declaration of Independence. It may have been an unintentional and to some an unwelcome political statement, but it was just as powerful as the purposeful and just as pragmatic Army of Blacks during the 1860s American Civil War. From numbers, let's turn to two individual soldier stories. There we go. These come from veterans' 19th century pension narratives, which historian John C. Dan called one of the largest oral history projects undertaken. Former New York private Benjamin Lattimore, born a free man in Wethersfield, Connecticut in 1761, submitted an extensive service narrative. Here are a few excerpts. In the month of September 1776, he enlisted as a private in Captain Amos Hutchins' company, 5th New York Regiment, then under the command of Colonel Louis Du Bois. A few days after his enlistment, he went with his regiment by water from New Mulberry to New York. On their arrival, the American Army, commanded by General Washington, which had been fighting with the enemy, was retreating from Long Island. A very few days afterwards, a skirmish was had between a part of our troops and the enemy, likely Harlem Heights, on 16 December 1776. And the truce was declared for the purpose of burying the dead. After this skirmish, our troops marched back to Kingsbridge, and after remaining there a considerable time, they went to White Plains. 2 months following the 28 October 1776 battle there, it was time to go into winter quarters when they passed through a place then called Crum Pond and Peekskill, where they halted a number of days. They then went by water to New Windsor. At this point, Lattimore was ill and furloughed home, staying there until April 1777. He continues with the description of the capture of Fort Montgomery. He noted, went by water to Fort Montgomery at the Highlands. General George Clinton had command of the fort. In the early part of October, some vessels belonging to the enemy came in sight, and when within 5 miles of the fort, the wind having slackened, he disembarked at a place called Dunkerbarock, or Thunder Hill, and marched from thence to the fort. Before they arrived at the fort, Governor Clinton sent out different detachments of men to meet them, and a fire was kept up between them and the enemy until our men returned to the fort. Shortly after, orders were given by Governor Clinton to stop firing as the enemy had sent a flag by Lieutenant Colonel Mungo Campbell of the 52nd Regiment. The colonel approached near to me at the gates of the fort and was met on the outside of the fort by Governor Clinton and 5th New York Dr. Samuel Cook. The colonel was asked by Governor Clinton the nature of his business, who replied that he came to demand a surrender of the fort, which if done within 1 hour and our troops grounded to arms, they would be permitted to go free. Governor Clinton replied that the fort would not be surrendered as long as he had a man able to fire a gun. Colonel Campbell then said he would sleep in the fort that night or in hell. They then parted. An attack was made on the fort by the enemy and was defended until 6 or 7 o'clock p.m. when it was taken. Governor Clinton, General James Clinton, Colonel Du Bois, Dr. Cook, and others escaped. In taking the fort, Colonel Campbell was killed. He was stabbed on the walls of the fort by Captain James Rosecrans, 5th New York, of Fishkill. The enemy and the prisoners of whom this declarant was one remained until the latter part of October, when the fort was destroyed by the enemy and they all went by water to New York. By his testimony in March 1778, Lattimore, forced to become a loyal officer's servant, was recaptured by American forces. Taken to Major General Israel Putnam, who discovered his identity, he was ordered back to his unit, then at New Windsor. Du Bois's regiment joined the main army at White Plains, and late that autumn returned northward to spend the winter at Schoharie, New York. Lattimore's narrative concludes with New York Brigade's participation in Major General Sullivan's 1779 exhibition against the British Allied Iroquois tribes. And that's in my book, but I won't include that here. Of all the Black Virginia Continentals found from my study, Andrew Pebbles had perhaps the most varied career. In his pension testimony, Pebbles noted he didn't recall the year he enlisted, being a poor, unlearned mulatto. According to his military records, it was 15 September 1777. He testified that he joined the camp at Valley Forge and was placed under the command of Captain Lewis Booker, 11th Virginia Regiment, for 2 years. At Trenton, he served 1 year in the artillery under Captain William Miller, 1st Continental Artillery Regiment, who commanded the gun with 12 men to which he belonged. He served for 2 years under Captain Michael Rudolph of Maryland in the light infantry commanded by Colonel Harry Lay. Of course, that was Henry Lay, father of Robert E. Lay. whose command was composed of infantry and cavalry, Rees Legion. He was in 3 general actions at Monmouth, Guilford Courthouse, and Utah Springs. At Utah Springs, he received 3 wounds. He was wounded in the shoulder slightly, lost the thumb of the left hand, and was bayoneted in the belly. He was discharged on Combahee River honorably. The day before he was discharged, he was in a battle in which Colonel John Lawrence, who was commanded in the absence of Colonel Lee, was killed, 27 August, 1782. Now Peebles, though a free man, had to deal with the issue of slavery post-war. In his pension, he testified, "By occupation, I'm a miller. From the infirmities of old age, increased by the wounds received in the Revolutionary War, I am not able to render much service to my employer. I am a free mulatto. My wife and child who live at the mill where I do are slaves. My wife's name is Rachel, aged between 15 and 60 years, and my child's name is Ursula, aged 11 years. Several other Southern veterans told of enslaved family members when they applied for pensions in the early 19th century, and I'll just read one. Michael Curtis, a Maryland Regiment veteran, served in the battles of Guilford Courthouse on 15 March 1781, Camden, actually Hobkirk's Hill near Camden, 25 April 1781, and at Utah Springs, 8 September 1781. In an 1821 deposition, Curtis stated his spouse had died and that the children born by my wife, deceased, are slaves. Now I want to get back to the only American black and Indian regiment. And I want to do this because there's a lot of misinformation about the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. The unit often associated with African-American Revolutionary soldiers is the so-called Black 1st Rhode Island Regiment. In reality, it existed as such only from March 1778 to June 1780, 2 years and 3 months. It never was large enough to form a full regiment, and because of that, never served with Washington's main army until after the unit joined the 2nd Rhode Island in 1781, when they were consolidated to form the Rhode Island Regiment. So let's have a brief look at events before and soon after the 1st Rhode Island Regiment became the only segregated Continental Regiment. Little is known of African American numbers in the early war Rhode Island regiments, but Massachusetts General William Heath's 1775 letter noted, "The regiments of Rhode Island have a number of Negroes and Indians." All the Rhode Island regiments from 1775 through 1777 contained black soldiers serving alongside their white comrades. With the Continental Army's 1777 rebirth, only the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island regiments remained, recruited with men enlisted or re-enlisted for 3 years for the duration of the war. Come on, there we go. On October 22, 1777, the 2 Rhode Island regiments, supported by artillery, successfully defended Fort Mercer against a brigade of Hessian troops. Again in 1777, the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island regiments were integrated organizations with white, black, and Indian soldiers serving side by side. 5 days after the battle, both regiments numbered 369 non-commissioned officers, musicians, and privates. Of those killed at Fort Mercer, 48, 12.6% were soldiers of color, including 39 African Americans, 10.3% of the whole, 7 Native Americans, 1.8%, and 2 mixed African Indians, 0.52%. The Rhode Island regiments were particularly hard hit during the 1777 campaign, and the state had to consider how to recruit them. General James Varnum recommended in January 1778 that a battalion of Negroes be raised in Rhode Island. That February, the state legislature resolved that any Negro, mulatto, or Indian man slave in this state may enlist into either of the 2 battalions to serve during the continuance of the war. It was eventually determined that these recruits would join only the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, and that unit would contain only black or Native American privates with white commissioned officers, sergeants, and corporals. Governor Cook noted in late February, "The number of slaves in the state is not great, but it is generally thought that 300 and upwards will be enlisted. Any slaves accepted received their freedom, and their owners were remunerated." So those slaves that were enlisted in that regiment, they were freed before they joined the regiment, or as they joined the regiment. So they served as free men. They received their freedom right away. Unpopular with many residents, in early May, the legislature set a June 10, 1778 cutoff date for slave recruiting, though free blacks could continue to enlist. Despite Cook's assurances, at best less than 150 African Americans ever joined the 1st Regiment and was never able to form a full battalion for service with Washington's main army. While the 1st Rhode Island Command Staff was recruiting slaves in their home state, the regiment's enlisted personnel remained at Valley Forge were incorporated into the 2nd Regiment. At the same time, the veteran black soldiers from both regiments were formed into a single segregated company under Captain Thomas Arnold. Arnold's large company, some 60 privates by spring 1778, belonged to the absent 1st Regiment, but while with the main army fielded with Colonel Israel Angle's 2nd Rhode Island. When Washington's forces confronted the British at the June 28, 1778 Battle of Monmouth, Captain Arnold's Black Company marched to Monmouth Courthouse with Varno's brigade and Major General Charles Lee's advance force. Early in the action, having attacked the British rearguard, Lee's men retreated in the face of superior forces, withdrawing towards General Washington's marching troops. Meeting the main army's van, General Lee encountered Washington, who placed Lee in charge of an ad hoc holding action. Lieutenant Colonel Jeremiah Olney described the Rhode Island troops during the ensuing defense. So here, as part of this defense, there were several other regiments involved, but you have the all-white 2nd Rhode Island Regiment and just a single company, a single black and Indian company of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. After retiring something more than a mile, General Varno's brigade was ordered to halt and formed by a cross fence, or hedgerow, for anybody who knows about a battle, to cover 2 pieces of artillery which were in danger of being lost. We there exchanged about 10 rounds and were then obliged to retire with considerable loss, but not until the enemy had outflanked us and advanced with charged bayonets to the fence by which we had formed. Our brigade suffered more than any that was engaged. The enemy did not pursue us far in our retreat, observing our army formed on the heights in our rear. And if you visit Monmouth battlefield today, you can actually go exactly to the place of where the Rhode Island troops fought. Captain Arnold's leg was amputated as a result of his wound in that action, and one of Arnold's men, Richard Rhodes, related in the 19th century, he's very much crippled in one arm in consequence of the wound received in the Battle of Monmouth. He was born in Africa, brought to this country, and sold as a slave, and enlisted in the Black Regiment to obtain his freedom. Arnold's company joined the 1st Rhode Island in July 1778. That regiment went on to see combat at the August 1778 Battle of Rhode Island, and remained in their home state until marching into New York to be consolidated with the 2nd Regiment in early 1781. So just to get an overview of the numbers, we can see the number of black soldiers and Indian soldiers at the Battle of Fort Mercer in 1777, 12.6% of rank and file strength. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment, Black Regiment, formed in March 1778 and merged with the State Levy Regiment in June 1780. In August 1778, it contained 188 black soldiers plus 5 Indians and 4 with mixed Indian African American blood, during that time called mustees. In September 1779, the 1st Rhode Island had only 147 soldiers of color. And by June 1780, only 124 black and Indian soldiers remained. Formed into 2 large companies, they were attached to an understrength Rhode Island 6-month levy battalion. And in 1781, those 2 companies were joined with the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, to form the Rhode Island Regiment. By September 1781, the 2 black and Indian companies numbered 108 privates and were on the way to Yorktown, Virginia. Adding black musicians and soldiers on other duties, at that time soldiers of color comprised 29% of the Rhode Island Regiment. Now, before we move on a bit more about this unit, segregated Rhode Island Regiment was an outlier, an experiment born of necessity in an army of integrated units. The experiment was largely unsuccessful, but through no fault of its own. The fact that the regiment remained seriously understrength through the entire term of its existence was largely due to the legislature cutting off slave enlistment after only 4 months. Still, in the 19th century, the Black Regiment became a symbol, an example of our African American ability as soldiers, and was seen by many as a precursor to the United States colored regiments that were formed during our American Civil War. Let's see what we have next. Oops. Yeah, too early. So we've seen how slavery could affect free black soldiers after the war, free black veterans after the war, but even serving soldiers were not immune to that threat. A late war soldier-civilian confrontation emphasizes the perils black soldiers were exposed to, even from their fellow revolutionaries. Free Black Fortune Stoddard began his military career with the integrated Rhode Island 1780 6-month State Battalion. Re-enlisting in the 1781 Rhode Island Regiment that December, after the Yorktown siege, he and a number of other Rhode Island soldiers were quartered on the first floor of a home at the head of Elk, Maryland. Upstairs, a group of seamen were celebrating. Inebriated, the seaman's captain, James Cunningham, descended to the first floor and commenced abusing the soldiers, particularly Stoddard, who assaulted with his fists and a small round chair. Private Stoddard called on the captain to cease. At that point, Connecticut Captain Ebenezer Wales entered and confronted the sea captain Cunningham, who in turn threatened Wales, who then had the seamen ousted at the point of the soldiers' bayonets. Cunningham and his men returned the next day and demanded alcohol from the homeowner, which he refused. The sound of breaking furniture drew two unarmed Rhode Islanders upstairs. One was knocked to the floor, and Benjamin Blanchard, a white Rhode Island private, retreated downstairs. When the seamen followed him down, the rest of the soldiers were ready with loaded muskets and fixed bayonets. One white private aimed at Captain Cunningham's chest, but a seaman seized the weapon from the soldier, upon which the captain grabbed it and struck the soldier's head. At this, Private Stoddard fired, hitting Cunningham in the groin, a wound that proved mortal. Fortune Stoddard was arrested and tried for murder in the Cecil County, Maryland civil court. He was eventually convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to be branded, specifically burnt in the bone of the left thumb with a hot iron. That being done, Stoddard was still required to pay court costs, but not having the funds to do so, he remained confined. So finally, the county government settled on the solution that he be sold into slavery to pay his debt. Fortunately, the Rhode Island commander brought the case to General Washington's attention, and 8 months after the incident, the Continental Congress decided that the state of Maryland be requested to discharge from confinement Fortune Stoddard, a soldier belonging to the Rhode Island Regiment, confined for costs accrued in a late prosecution, and charge such costs to the United States, in order that the same may be charged to the said soldier and deducted out of his pay. Now, a similar case had occurred in April 1781, not even a year earlier. Rhode Island Private Prince Green, another black soldier, was on nighttime guard duty in Providence when he spotted and challenged somewhere near his post. Calling for the person to halt and not being complied with, Green fired and killed 23-year-old Edward Allen. Green was arrested by civil authorities and charged with murder. The death of a citizen at the hands of a soldier would have reduced a tumult in Providence, but that the soldier was black and his victim white most likely added to the uproar. The trial was held in county court 4 days after the shooting, and Prince Green was convicted of manslaughter. His sentence was to receive an M-shaped brand on his hand and to pay all court costs. Green soon returned to his regiment and served to the end of the war. Fortune Stoddard never reappeared on his regiment's muster rolls and was likely confined to the war's end. He did eventually return to Rhode Island and lived in Newport, where he married, raised a family, and by 1805 was working as a chimney sweep. That both Green's and Stoddard's murder charges resulted in manslaughter convictions that did not require confinement speaks to some fairness in the jury's deliberations, despite the then common, but to us barbaric, sentence of branding. The most telling and horrifying result is the Cecil County government's suggestion that Fortune Stoddard, a soldier, be sold into slavery to pay the owed court costs. Beyond any other opinions on the matter, no white soldier could be subjected to the same solution. Now we meet Mrs. Lyons. We can find her. There we go. I now want to speak of the African American women who, by their own free will or the will of others, served with the Army. To correct the popular opinion of Army women, black and white, they were by and large respectable and respected. Any women who were not long tolerated. I discovered a number of black women with the Army, some of them servants. One of those was Hannah Till, who served in General Washington's military household and gave birth to a son in Valley Forge. Another was Sarah, a slave who emancipated herself and her son and joined the 1st Maryland Regiment for several months in 1778. But I want to focus on one woman, Judith Lyons, and read a portion of her letter written to her by her husband, published for the first time in my book. Before I go on, I must say that there are 2 other existing letters from Continental Army black soldiers, and I think there may be a 4th, but I'm not too sure of that. One of those other known letters, one man was enslaved and the other a freedman. Both men could not write and dictated their missives to someone else. Those letters were not sent to family. One letter was written to the slave soldier's master, while the other was written to the soldier's former owners. Now to preface the Lyons letter. John Lyons enlisted in the 5th Connecticut Regiment in March 1781 for 3 years. Part of his time was spent at West Point, another Hudson Highland post. By Judith Lyons' own testimony, they married in July 1781. She recalled in 1782, the next summer after I married, he sent for me to come to him. I think the place was called the Highlands, and that time my husband was a waiter to Colonel Sherman. And while at the camp, I had the smallpox. I think I stayed 3 or 4 months. Now, if anybody's familiar with the smallpox, it's a pretty horrific disease to contract, and it can be really disfiguring if you don't die from it. Mrs. Lyons noted in a pension application, "My husband used to write to me when he was in the Army. I have one of his letters now, which I give to the magistrate who takes this my deposition. It is dated November 11, 1781, and is in the handwriting of my husband." Now the letter. I take this opportunity to send to you, my dear and loving wife, to let you know that I am well, and hoping these lines may find you and the children well. This is the 6th letter of mine, and I haven't received one. That's the perennial soldier's complaint. I belong to Colonel Isaac Sherman's regiment, Captain Rice's company. We lay at Fishkill now. I should be very glad if you would send me a letter how you've lived this summer, and whether the house is done, and whether you killed the cow, or whether you've got another. I want to know all these things very much. I intend to come home this winter if I can, but I don't know if I can. If I can see you myself, then I can talk with you, my dear wife, as I like. I have seen hard times. I have lived 11 days with bread only. I remain your loving husband until death, John Lyons. Now, of course, that shows that he was worried about conditions at home, where Judith, unless she had the help of maybe neighbors or relatives, which we don't know, but basically Judith, the entire keeping of the household and the livestock was on her. Oops. Lyons and other veterans returned home to a changed and changing nation. Despite the waning of Northern slavery with the ratification of the 1789 United States Constitution and boosted by the 1794 Cotton Gin Patent, black bondage was cemented as a political and economic fact. And detrimental racial attitudes hardened before, but more especially after 1800. 35 years after the war, black revolutionary veterans, along with their white comrades, were eligible for service pensions, but even in that system, they experienced the effect of increasing bias. When all was said and done, African-American military service was a direct challenge to slavery and the racial construct, and an affront to some white citizens. Still, black Americans continued to fight for their nation, as 81-year-old Judith Lyons related in 1837. My youngest son died of a wound received in the last war, the War of 1812. His name was Benjamin. The wound was received at the Battle of Chippewa, July 5, 1814. And black revolutionary veterans remain proud of their service, as attested by Arturo Freeman, who in his pension application valued all his belongings at $15.75. At the end of the list, he added one more item: Revolutionary uniform, invaluable. And in closing, former Private Henry Hallowell, a white 5th Massachusetts Regiment veteran, gave this simple but fitting tribute to the African-American soldiers, free and slave, who served the revolutionary cause in a number of roles. He wrote, "In my company, there was 4 Negroes named Jephthah Ward, Job Upton, Douglas Middleton, and Pomp Simmons. Part of them called on me after their time was out. They were good soldiers." So that is the end of my presentation. There we go. There's my first book. I will tell you a secret. It is available free online. I really shouldn't say that, but what the heck. I actually put a PDF online. It lacks the cover and also lacks the center color illustrations. But it's available for those. If you take my card and you email me, I'll send you the link to the book. If you would like to have a hard copy, I only have three for sale. I sold 2 after I got the shipment, and thus it is. Oh God, that was in autumn 2022. I received a call from Don Haggis, who I know. From Don Triani, who I know from having met him over the years and also modeled for some of his paintings. and he had the surprising offer, he wanted me to do a book with him. And it was on black soldiers, but it was on black soldiers over 111 years. But it was also, over those 111 years, it was on black soldiers in American, Spanish, French, British, and German units. So 3 wars, 5 countries, and that will be coming out in January 2025. If anybody's interested in getting a glance at the cover or even the inners of the book, I actually have a printed out copy over there if you want to take a look at the book that's coming out in January. And again, if you're, I have a pile of cards. If you're interested, my email's on there. I mean, I'll be happy to get back to anybody who emails me. Yes.
Thank you so much for a very enlightening part of American history that I thought I knew something about that I knew absolutely nothing about. I have a couple of questions. One question is, so they would fight in platoons or things, and they were segregated or they were mixed up?
They were integrated.
They were what?
Integrated.
They were integrated.
Yeah, so okay. Black and Indian soldiers served alongside white soldiers.
Okay.
And that's
how come none of this kind of history is taught in school? Well, we study.
I don't know. Like I said, I found out from in doing my new book that the same thing happened in the French and Indian War in New England, and also in New York regiments, and also a few Southern regiments too. But the difference being that in Southern regiments, blacks were not allowed to bear arms. They could. That was so. But they're still integrated.
My next question was like, so some of them would be musicians, like the drummers and the fifers and stuff like that, and of course I'm sure they use them for cooking and things like that too. Or no, everybody cooked their own food.
But that's the thing. Okay. I mean, there were 6-man messes, so either everybody took their turn, or one man decided he wanted to be the cook the entire time. So it depended on it didn't go by race.
All right, that's better than I was thinking. And my other question was, did they have to bring their own guns, or were they supplied with guns?
They were supplied guns. And that's even true with a lot of the militia.
Of the
Revolutionary War, yeah. I mean, in some militias, some men brought their own guns. Some militias, more men brought their own guns than others. But many militia units, Pennsylvania being one of them, the men were largely issued weapons. They didn't, not always, but they're largely issued weapons, yeah.
And then just as a guesstimate, like approximately what percentage of the soldiers from the American Revolution were free, enslaved, brown, mulatto, or indigenous? Like 20 to 25%? I mean,
the only hard number we have is that 1778 return, and that shows that 3.6% of men in those 20,000 men in 15 brigades, 3.6 were black, and black, mulatto, all the colors. We have no idea what the number of free soldiers were, free black soldiers were. Mm-hmm. I mean, it could actually be even a little bit less than enslaved soldiers. We just don't know. And for years we thought that return actually showed everybody free and enslaved. So now we know at the very least that the presence of black soldiers in the Army was higher than that 3.6%. We just don't know how much higher.
Thank you so much for great information.
Did I hear you say they were paid an equivalent wage?
Oh yeah. Despite.
Did they have a harder time getting their benefits? Yes,
With the pensions?
The pensions, yeah. I remember.
It varied, but yes, generally black veterans had
a harder time.
Yeah,
that's
You can, if you look at the pension applications, if not all, but some men went through a number of applications and they had to get extra support, extra depositions, and more support from notable people to finally get their pension. And some were refused. I mean, even in the end, they were still refused. So, I mean, again, there were a lot of other reasons, but with the increase of abolitionism, the racial animus hardened. I mean, especially in the South, but also in the North. Mm-hmm. I mean, it just did. So that was all part and parcel of the pension system, because those were citizens filling those roles that were awarding pensions. Yeah.
I heard you touch upon it, but I missed a key word. The first Rhode Island, you said, basically was unsuccessful because the legislature cut off, and I missed what you said. Did you say enlistment or
Cut off slave recruiting.
slave recruiting?
Yeah, after it cut it off after 4 months.
And what, do you know why?
Now I've only read that it was unpopular. I never found out. Nobody ever wrote down why it was unpopular, but it was unpopular because the masters, the slave owners, had to be agreeable, because they were paid, I think it was $300 for their servant, for their slave, and then that man was from that point free.
Did they have to be agreeable, or were the slaves enlisting?
No,
And then they were getting paid and thinking, I'd rather have the service.
That actually did happen in a couple instances. There was one instance where a man in Massachusetts who, number one, he didn't want his slave to enlist, his man to enlist, and he was from another state entirely, so he actually reclaimed his man, his slave. Yeah. So instances like that did happen. In one case, one of those letters from a black soldier was from a Rhode Island soldier who had been a slave and then had been released by his master and put into the regiment. At that point, I don't know whether he was sick or what it was, but he was writing for his master to take him back, because he was having a hard time of it. And like I said, he might have been really ill and really beat up just from the service. Yeah.
And just a follow-up, so was the first Rhode Island a mixture of slave and free black soldiers, or was it basically entirely
well, from March 1778 to June 1780, there were free black soldiers, there were formerly enslaved soldiers, and then there were Native Americans, Indians. Now that act called for Indian, black mulatto and Indian man slaves. I have yet to find any Indians who were enslaved and put in the regiment, but Indian slavery was a thing in New England, especially in Rhode Island, and I think probably Connecticut too. Yeah.
I'm just gonna add, because this is the one that I know, is there was a guy named Scipio Two Shoes, who I think served in the second Rhode Island, and he was half black, half Wanchung.
Oh, cool.
But his mother was indigenous and his father was African, and so the laws of the United States at the time were, slavery passed through the mother,
right,
and not the father. So he was half black, but because his mother was indigenous, he was born free. But he had siblings who were enslaved.
Oh, jeez.
And he actually purchased them.
Oh, really?
So that was one way that he could keep his family together. But he served in the second Rhode Island.
There was a New Jersey soldier who, funnily enough, served in a Massachusetts regiment, just because of the peregrinations of it. He was an indentured servant and traveled all around, ended up in Massachusetts. But after the war, 1789, I think, he actually freed his wife. He freed his fiancée and married her. So that did happen, and all these stories. When you get into the speaking to the Lattimore descendants, all these stories are amazing when you can get the details of life before and after the war for these soldiers. Like the one soldier he just mentions in passing that he was born in Africa and came over. So yeah, there's a lot of fascinating stuff to be found in little details of these guys' lives. Yeah.
I'm gonna be the loyalist devil's advocate and ask if you could talk about comparisons between formerly enslaved people serving in the Continental Army versus people under Dunmore's proclamation, the Phillipsburg Proclamation, joining the British Army.
They were freed. They were freed. Now British and loyalist officers still had slaves, and so did white loyalists still had slaves and kept them through the war. Eventually evacuated from the country. And the thing is, eventually there was some, like in Butler's Rangers, there were at least 2 black soldiers who served. That was a loyalist regiment on the frontier. In Loyalist militias and irregular units, there were black soldiers who served under arms, but they weren't on the establishment. In other words, they weren't supplied by the crown under crown regulations. So there is some variation, but for Loyalist units under crown regulations on the establishment, they were barred at first, and then eventually they became trumpeters, they became pioneers, they became drummers, as the war progressed. And then later in the war, you had, which is really interesting, you had you had the Black Pioneers too. The Black Pioneers was actually considered a crown unit. It wasn't a Loyalist unit; it was under the crown unit. That was a labor force. They didn't serve under arms, even though they served in combat, because when they fought at sieges, which they did at Charleston, and then the Southern contingent, when the beginning of the Southern contingent of the Black Pioneers fought at Charleston, that's where they were first formed. They were under fire because they were rebuilding fortifications under fire. So they may have assisted with the artillery in a pinch, but they were mostly serving with picks and shovels. The other interesting unit is the Black Dragoons, which was a South Carolina unit formed from free slaves. Was probably about 50, maybe 60 men, and at one time all the Southern cavalry units were combined to be trained under a single commander, because at that point their quality was noted to be not that good. And this is in December 1781. The quality was not noted to be that good. So they were all brought together and trained, and one of those units was the Black Pioneers, and they actually did very good service. And after the war, the British Black Pioneers as a unit and the Black Dragoons, they were sent to, I think it was Grenada, and they were reestablished as an armed unit of freed blacks.
Yeah, because what I had seen was that the Black Pioneers went to Nova Scotia and were disbanded.
Some of them did, but I think it's the Southern establishment of the Black Pioneers that were in Charleston.
Interesting.
And I cover this in my new book too, because it's a real web. And then eventually I forget what their name was when they were in Grenada, but eventually the remains of that unit that was originally formed by the Black Pioneers, the Southern Black Pioneers and the Black Dragoons, eventually became part of, I think, the first West India Regiment, which were black regiments, I think eventually amounting to, I guess, at least 10, I think, formed from free blacks in the British West Indies. So there's a through line from the Revolution, to the 1790s when the West India regiments are created. It's a fascinating period, it really is. And I'm glad I got to write more about it, because when you expand the timeline, it's even more fascinating. Yes.
Have you encountered much on the company of black soldiers that Humphreys tried recruiting? And I've seen some older sources indicating they may have served with the Rhode Island line at times, with the Rhode Island troops.
I'd love to see if they served the Rhode Island troops.
I was gonna say it's all older sources that I've seen.
But they were, when they were formed, it was 1782.
Yeah.
And they were only formed. They were formed in like March 1782 and disbanded that fall. So I think it was an experiment. And actually, there was a Massachusetts company that was also formed of black soldiers. Then that we know very little about. I have mention of it, but I don't know any details on it. I think Humphrey's company, I think basically they decided, the funny enough, it may have been just for aesthetics, because when you have a whole regiment formed, have all these white soldiers and then you have a black company. I mean, it sounds weird, but they might have done it just because of the way it looked.
Promo.
Yeah, it was kind of a cool look, but it didn't last. It didn't last past 1782. Yeah.
Did the Irish people that were in servitude basically owned by the colonists or the islands, did they come into the mix in this at all?
Well, there's a difference in the 17th century. Some Scots and also some Irish, but also a lot of British poor people who had no other. They were basically enslaved, and that's the 17th century. I think possibly the 16th century too. The difference between those enslaved whites was the fact that eventually they would become free. The different and black enslaved blacks, yeah, we're not going to become free.
Were they called that's the indentured
Well,
servant?
in the 17th century, it began with actually sending them overseas as more or less slaves, and then eventually, as more and more people decided to go to the colonies, the use of indenture, you know, those enslaved whites were basically labor, and basically unpaid labor. But eventually, as more and more people wanted to come over to the colonies, the use of indentures came into a heavy use. So you indentured yourself to somebody for a number of years. You were eventually released. You indentured yourself to somebody. They paid your passage over to the colonies. You worked for them for a certain number of years. You were lucky or unlucky, depending on whether you had a good master or a bad master. But eventually, you were freed.
And you're still legally a person.
Yes, you're still legally a person. Yeah, because there are laws on the treatment of indentured servants. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question for you about the 4th Regiment, because we know Benjamin Lattimore was in the 5th Regiment, but we recently found out his brother was in the 4th Regiment. I was talking about Roger Lattimore.
Yeah.
So
but I didn't know he was in the 4th.
He was in the 4th. So, do you know anything about Black Americans in the 4th Regiment?
There's very little information. Just like, when I did my first book, and other authors have found this, sometimes people go into a book on black soldiers of the Revolution and they think, oh, it's going to be easy because they're all going to have slave names, right? They're going to be Pompey, and they're going to, and they're going to have Roman names and all that stuff. It's like, no. There are a lot of them had names that you could not tell. So that's the problem with the Lattimore name and their first names. You can't tell they're black soldiers.
Right, and a lot of they would describe, and some of them, black soldiers, kind of by the time we get to the mid-1700s, look white, and someone would have looked at them and said, "No, you're a white person."
Right, and
there's had that many times.
And there are actually soldiers. My cousin's been doing a lot of work on this subject too. There are soldiers that who are black during the war but passed for white after the war. So it's a really interesting subject.
And some soldiers said, "No, I'm black."
Yes, yeah.
But they were put in with the white regiment.
So and that's the fun thing, because I love military history when it relates in some way to the civilian world. And that can happen with with soldiers cooking, or other things that happen in the Army. Wagons and watercraft. They're also used in the civilian world. But it's also the same thing with how these people were treated or behaved before and after the war and during the war. It's just a really fascinating subject. In the back, yeah.
Yeah, just to correct my sister a little bit.
Information. All right.
Yeah, Benoni, that's his real name.
Okay.
Enlisted in the militia first.
Okay.
Ulster County, and then he joined the 5th. Roger, I'm not sure which regiment his brother, he's 2 years older than him, joined I believe the 4th. He started out in the 4th, but he ended up in the 5th. And if you look at muster reports and muster rolls and the other reports they have, you'll see that they were following each other. They were at, different White Plains, different sites. They followed each other. Roger ended up staying in different militias in the war until 1784. Benjamin did his 3 years and was out. So we've been able to track it, going through Fold 3 and looking at the documents there. So they were in there together most of the time. And then I believe when Benjamin was captured by the British after Fort Montgomery and this place was burnt down, Roger and then he was released, Roger never came back home. So I don't know what that issue might have been with the family, with the father perhaps.
Yeah.
But maybe he was, because Roger enlisted at 17, Benjamin enlisted at 50. Maybe his father said, look out for him.
Right.
He's coming in, he's joining after you. And he never came back home, and when his father did his will, he wasn't even mentioned in the will.
Wow.
We don't know if he had passed or not,
Yeah.
but they were together.
There's always family dynamics.
Yeah.
Family
That's it.
secrets.
Yeah, it's really cool when you can get a timeline like that and kind of see them in relation to what each other was doing, and you got a good story.
And one more thing, we were just talking just previously about pensions and being able to get your pay years later, and I guess Benjamin's very successful in Albany, and he's been written about by historians and so forth. Created the first black school in Albany. He was, him and a number of the gentlemen. First Amy Church there. He was a member of the Temperance Society and so forth. So he was well known in Albany, even though he had to go in 1820 and do before the court and prove that he was a free black man. He went to the manumission and so forth. But I think it was 1834 that he had to go. He went in court to apply for his pension, because I guess there was I guess Washington or someone, or maybe it was the government that decided that people who had fought were able to come back and apply way after the fact, because we know the government didn't have money to pay a lot of people and there was all that stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
He was in his 70s when he applied for his pension.
Yeah, he was. Now he had a great lawyer, because everything was written out, and you've seen his pension documents, very thorough, and we've gone through it. But it was Abraham Godwin, who was one of the legislator in New Jersey. He was also a brigadier general, and he wrote a letter, and that letter was submitted also. So maybe that's why he was approved.
It helped if you had friends in high places. No matter who you were.
Some things don't change.
Yeah, really. Yeah. What's interesting about the pensions is when they passed the Pension Act, the legislator thought, oh, there can't be many left. They came out of the woodwork. So the first Pension Act, there was no limitation on the veterans. The second Pension Act, you had to be in need. So and unfortunately we lost some good pensions because veteran soldiers, they figured, oh well, I'm doing well enough, I don't need a pension. So good for them, but sorry for us. Yeah.
Yes, Benjamin had to have been doing well because he was well established in Albany, an abolitionist. He also he was the first cartman.
Oh wow.
He used to drive his little horse and buggy up and down the roads of Albany, picking up whatever he could. It was a lucrative business back then. You could set your own price. And he and his son was riding on the back of the cart. There are no portraits of him, but we have his son in his older years.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Very good. A portrait or a photograph?
It's a
photo.
It's a photo. That's very cool.
Well,
it's a photo.
Yeah, it's a photo. But the family, their history in Monroe County, they had an orchard farm, and it was near the canal. What's the name of that canal, Terry? Yes, they also had the Lattimore Ferry. So they thought that they...
Oh, very cool. Oh, that's awesome.
Right, they thought that they may have been helping runaway slaves because they purchased more land 45 minutes closer to the canal.
Oh, wow.
And they were going up to Canada with them.
Well, see, the interesting thing about Benjamin Lattimore is a lot of Revolutionary veterans did not do well after the war, and I'm talking white and black. I think the black veterans had a much harder time than the whites, but still. So Benjamin really, he found a community. He helped to found a community, and did well for himself. But a lot of you read some of the memoirs of those veterans that did, and some of them were officers too, and they still did not do that well after the war.
He had something to prove because they were labeling him as a deserter. He was captured here in the fort.
Yeah.
He had to prove he didn't have his papers with him.
Yeah.
So he went into court for the second time.
Yeah. Oh, good for him. He got it.
Good for us.
Yeah. Yeah. What's up?
I have one question.
Uh-huh.
Were any of the black soldiers ever allowed to rise in rank and become officers?
No, unless you want to think about, I think his name is Lewis Cook, who was a Pennsylvania Indian, who actually received the Continental Army rank of colonel, and he was actually half black and half Indian. He didn't command a regiment, but he actually did become a colonel. Other than that, no. My cousin has found a few more black men who rose to the rank of either corporal or sergeant, but they're still few and far between.
There are some indigenous guys who get up to captain.
Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah. And that's another. That'd be a whole interesting book on itself. Would be just Native Americans in the Continental Army, because that would include the Stockbridge Company and and all that. And that's that's a really fascinating subject. I've written a little bit on that, but
The third book.
yeah. Actually, somebody's talked about that. I don't know. We'll see. Any more questions?
Well, how long did it take for you to write the first book, and how long the second?
Well, to begin at the beginning,
Somebody's got something on her mind.
I've written 2 articles on black soldiers in the Army, and one of them was just on black soldiers in Southern Continental regiments. And I posted them on LinkedIn, and that's where the British editor asked me, he said, would you want to do a book? And he said, you could do it on this subject, on black soldiers, or anything else. And I thought like 5 minutes. Well, I went through one deadline. I hadn't done anything. So that was about a year. And I wrote him, and he said, that's all right, we have other stuff that in the line, that's okay. So I thought, okay, I really got to get down. I think after I told him, I think it took me about 5 months to really get myself moving. And I just had a back operation, so there wasn't much else to do. So that one, it took me from about August of one year to March of the next. And then this one, I was gathering information from like September of one year to probably March of the next year, and then I wrote from March and I turned it in on New Year's Day. So it was kind of intense because I was co-authoring the book, so I had to answer my co-author, he was actually very good. But then I had to deal with the editor too, so it was kind of an interesting enterprise. But yeah.
I was gonna say that's pretty quick, actually.
Yeah, it was, like I said, it was very intense. I mean, when I handed it in, I almost felt like I had been holding my breath all that time, and I was letting it out, and it took a long time to really get the stress out of it. It was really weird. I never experienced anything like that before.
So what's the next project?
Well, actually, next project is an article, and it's female entrepreneurs supplying the Continental Army.
Cool.
And it's based on
I'm sorry, could you?
Female entrepreneurs supplying the Continental Army, and it goes from Virginia in 1775 to Pennsylvania, and then New Jersey. And that's in 78, 79, 80, and then it goes back to Philadelphia in 1782 to 84. So it's kind of a through line. Yeah.
Have you had any support from, we're daughters and sons of the American Revolution. Have you had support from the daughters of the American Revolution for women or for anything?
I've never gotten any grants for any of my work.
But have you spoken with them or had any?
No, I haven't. I spoke to one SAR in Washington D.C. Oh, also one SAR in New Jersey, Metuchen, New Jersey, but never DAR. Oh, actually, what am I thinking of? It was actually during COVID, which I was kind of sad about because I would like to have gone down. But I actually spoke to for the national headquarters in D.C. But it was a Zoom presentation, which. They reach more. Zoom presentations are great because they reach more people. They reach people that can't either are so far afield that they can't get to the talk, or they may be in the area but they can't get out. They just can't get out. But for me, it's also frustrating because I like to come and, you know, present in person too. So, I mean, I'm willing to do both, but, you know, they're different, but they both work. Any other questions?
Going once?
Curious.
Yeah.
There's two organizations, Sons of the American Revolution, and in Manhattan, I don't know where else they're located, but they're the Sons of the Revolution.
Oh,
Do you have any information on the Sons of the
No.
Revolution?
no, I don't know about them at all, really.
They're based in Louisville, Kentucky.
Oh,
Their
really?
headquarters
Okay.
is Louisville, Kentucky.
Huh. No, I mean, because the big name is the SAR.
Well, yeah.
And probably I've heard of the Sons of the Revolution, but in my mind, I probably just connected it with the larger organization or the other organization. So yeah, I don't know anything about it. Yeah.
There's an organization, Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York.
What's that? I'm sorry.
There's one, Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York. Is
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Really?
Because
Yeah.
they're associated with Francis Avenue.
Oh,
That's it.
okay.
That's
Okay.
the one.
Well, that's-
Okay.
Is that separate from the national organization or it falls
It's
under
It's
the?
separate, it's different.
Oh, so,
Huh.
oh, okay.
The DAR holds their meetings there as well. It's a museum as well.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
actually going to expand their exhibit on the Birch trials.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's-
really?
I
Yeah,
just
it's
saw
going
that
on.
the other day. Yeah.
I've never been. Because
You
kinda
never
hard
been
to-
to Francis?
what's that?
You never been to Francis?
I've never been to Francis.
Oh,
no.
God, you
Oh,
have to go.
oh my goodness.
Yeah, every time I was in New York, it was usually to take our kids to see a show. So
I would go to Francis.
yeah, I gotta
Check their
go,
website.
and I
That's
gotta get to
lectures.
Brooklyn too.
They have lectures and, they're gonna have the evacuation ceremony.
That's pretty
there
cool.
and stuff
That's
in
cool.
November.
Yeah, I'm 67 and there's still a lot I haven't done. But there's still time.
Oh, remember.
Anything else?
Last chance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
When you talk about, when you
Oh, you're
soldiers,
welcome.
black soldiers applying for pensions,
Yeah.
and they were refused, like, if they did fight, so they couldn't prove that they did fight, or?
Well, they see sometimes the muster rolls weren't available, and sometimes I forgot to mention this because there's so much to mention. Sometimes a black man, usually enslaved or formerly enslaved, fought during the war under one name, his slave name, and then after the war changed his name to his own name, to the name he wanted. So when you went to apply for a pension, nobody could find your name because it wasn't there. You know, your current name, and that you see that in some of the pensions where they somebody gives a supporting deposition and they said, well, yes, but he served, he fought under such and such a name. So you do get that in depositions where it is corrected and the guys get the depositions, but it's an additional problem.
Can you get the officer to vouch for it?
Yeah, they did, but that depends on whether the officers, some officers, like Massachusetts, some officers moved out to Ohio. Some officers either passed away or moved, or so. One man, I think in the South, I think he traveled like 300 miles, and he wasn't young. He wasn't a young guy. He traveled like 300 miles to get a deposition from somebody for his. So these guys are working hard for these. And some of the veterans, they couldn't get around very much. They were pretty bad shape themselves. So yeah, it's a great resource. It's a little bit of a sad story, again, because the veterans after the first act, and they all had to reapply after the first act. So some of them, either got their pensions and died immediately. Some of them died before they could get a pension. So it's a varied story. It really is, but it's such an interesting story. Such a great story. Yeah.
I just want to thank Grant for inviting me and you providing with all this great information.
Well, I'm happy to. We've been going back and forth because first it was COVID, and then I was.
This talk was 5 years in
Yeah.
making.
And then there was then I was in my intense period of writing the second book, and it's like I